All right, so good afternoon. We're going to get this conversation started for week three um, question. And should I read the question, you two, to
Yeah.
start us off? All right, awesome. So this week's question for this discussion is defending qualitative research. What problem might you choose to study using a qualitative research? How will you defend your choice of qualitative over quantitative to someone who doesn't understand qualitative research? So, keeping with what I heard in our face-to-face, I'm going to try to keep this simple for now, and then if we discuss things later and expand on them, that's cool. But the problem that I may choose is a practical problem that we're actually looking at right now at Kalamazoo Valley, and we have a key performance indicator of really trying to understand if students feel like they belong on campus. And we have a statement problem that reads they are not attending events and activities on campus in a way that we feel like they should. So that's the problem statement, right? And so from a quantitative standpoint, that would be us creating a baseline and looking at the data and statistics that says, okay, out of how many participants, who feels what way, and then who feel another way, how many folks are telling us that they feel like they belong, and how many people feel like they don't belong. That's the quantitative side of things. But my argument for the qualitative would be, okay, then why? What is it that, or what is this this group's experience or these groups' experience as we maybe even, disaggregate the data. So it would give us a better understanding of why these particular people, one, feel like they belong, and then probably more so for the problem statement for those that probably don't feel like they belong. If I'm going to dig into the book and the text and read, directly from that, Cresswell and Hoff, if I'm saying that correctly, explain that qualitative research is appropriate when a complex, detailed understanding is needed. And I do think a detailed understanding would be needed, and that would be my argument, to better serve the students that don't feel like they belong, and then it gives us probably a window into both those that don't feel like they don't belong and those that feel like they do belong. So yeah, that would be my answer, and I'll shut it down from there. Come back later. Thank you.
I'm gonna go really fast because being distracted by the baby really quick. So let me go really fast. I'm gonna pull up a Google Docs that I had started. I was just writing things as I was reading. So if I'm not looking right at you, I'm still here. I'm just reading from the Google Docs. So one thing I saw from the chapter was talking about like qualitative research and like how to decipher that it is what's needed for your research. And one thing that stuck out to me is like one thing that says that it's used to evaluate like big thing and educational purposes. So like what's going on at your college? What's happening there? What needs to be studied and why it's happening? Are your students feeling welcome? So that involves you talking to them. That involves you evaluating them, doing interviews, group studies with them. So that is one way that qualitative research will come in over quantitative. And I was doing some more reading outside of like the readings that Professor had us do, looking at more what would quantitative research come in at. And I see that quantitative research is more statistical based research. So you already have kind of something like a starting base, I would say. And from there, you look at the stats of it. So that's how I feel where qualitative research will come in over that. And so for me personally, my hope one day is to work somewhere in university that deals with retention, especially of minority students. And so I feel within that area, I'm looking at how do we retain them? So we're going to look at interviewing them, looking at focus groups, looking at talking with them. So that is how the qualitative research will come in, because that focuses more on looking at like patterns and themes and how things are appearing within like those talks with them.
That actually reminds me of something Geppert and Rhymes, kind of the first thing that caught my eye about that that editorial is with quantitative research, you know the variables. So you know what you're going to test. Whereas with qualitative research, like with both of your examples, you're trying to like figure out what it is to even know how to address the problem. So if students aren't coming to an event, you don't know why. So you can't test if, you could quantitatively say, did you not come because of this? Did you not come because of this? But you would have to know what this is. And so qualitative research can be kind of the pipeline to getting to the variables maybe you do want to then test, but without first observing and collecting kind of, and we're also talking about humans. We're talking about humans and their social interaction, which is something that Creswell also talks about, is that interaction between two humans. Quantitative research doesn't really get at very well. Quantitative research, you can kind of have a hypothesis and you can prove it right or wrong. But interacting with people, or whether you're going to go to an event, there's so much that comes into play. Trice, how many times did we look at the weather and think, well, our event's going to be an absolute failure, or it's a beautiful day out and we need to get more pizza because everyone's going to come. And we may be wrong. There may have been traffic, and so then no one came. So that's qualitative, gives you an opportunity to kind of observe the landscape by which you are in, and observe and take away from that and participate in interpreting that. So you can kind of get a rich picture of what is happening that is kind of accurate through the eyes of the people you are studying. Whereas quantitative, is this the right thing to test? If we say students don't come to events because the pizza is from Jimmy John or Papa John's, yes or no? Is that really going to give Trice any information about what to do? Will he see more people if he switches to Domino's Pizza? Probably not. That's probably not the issue. And talking to people, observing, collecting their responses to things, and really kind of being able to test it is really going to kind of dig at what is, and then you can be actionable about it. Probably not something as simple as a yes or no to a pizza. It's probably something more complex, and that's where qualitative research methods really kind of help outline these things and kind of get to the complexity of human experience, the way quantitative is really, really good at kind of figuring out if yes or no. So, I don't feel well. Well, here, take a COVID test. Do you have COVID? Yes or no? Well, if I don't have COVID, I still don't feel well. That test didn't solve my problem. So, we gotta, look at more observable things.
Yeah. In other words, and this goes back to what we discussed during our face-to-face was, I believe it was Dr. B brought up an example of her husband being, a statistical person. But the qualitative research really gets at the why, right? Of everything. When statistical analysis fails to capture the complexity, as you mentioned, of the problem being examined, you do want to dig more and more, and you really want to understand why. Why is this happening, as opposed to just having the numbers of telling you how many did this and how many didn't do this. Whatever it is you're looking for, then you look at the why. Why is this happening? And this goes into people's experiences. And another thing that came up too, probably me, here's some confirmation bias, is when you want to now give people voices, right? What you're going to probably uncover is some information, and that give voices to those that maybe doesn't have a voice or don't have a strong enough voice from a social issue, right? Social impact standpoint. So that would be another argument in this regards, as you, Alisha, have alluded upon, is the human interaction of it all, right? Just the humanity of it. And I believe this is where qualitative becomes so huge, especially in higher education, where we're trying to understand our students and understand how to best move our, where the innovation best lies, right? Is asking these questions and truly understanding where our students are coming from, and more so where we need to go to best support them.
As you mentioned, that with looking at quantitative and statistics, things like that, that qualitative work can get your question you needed to go to the quantitative side. So that's how you can measure. That's how you would from there utilize that to measure, create your hypothesis. So you can measure the data that has come upon you that you have found. So again, I feel like qualitative is a stepping stone to maybe even get to that qualitative. Qualitative is a stepping stone to get to that quantitative work that you may want to do in the future, to see if like there's like a way you can measure it and like bring out the stats of things.
Yeah, the Cross article had a really good like analysis of just what you were saying. So qualitative, from a few observations and people making meaning, you can then generalize something. And then you can use quantitative to test that generalization. So, you know, in order to have something to test, you should probably observe what's happening. So I kind of think, you know, qualitative kind of is the precursor to all quantitative research. I mean, to a certain degree, you have to know the world. You have to observe the world in order to create the variables you're going to test with quantitative. But then I think Trice, what you were kind of getting at is that there's actually like that's one excellent pathway, and I think that's one with our positivist education and where we've always come from the scientific method that makes the most sense to us. But the other piece of qualitative research is really kind of understanding meaning making and how meaning making how different people draw conclusions or understand the world or see themselves interacting in that world in and of itself is important and is something policymakers should be aware of. It should be, you know, when we take a direction, when we try to change how people feel, how belonging happens on campus, it really is how people are making that meaning that matters. It's not necessarily the generalization to the whole. Because there may be some groups that don't ever, you know, get addressed because they're small in number, which, you know, the quantitative, once you do generalize, you do test, you know, quantitatively, you may not be picking them up. So qualitative is a good way to get at smaller, often marginalized populations whose voices would get muffled in a bigger data set. I'll stop there.
I'll add this, and I think for me, maybe this to shut this down, or something that's become fascinating over the last 3 or 4 minutes that we've had this conversation, is the dichotomy of maybe a mixed methods approach, or the finding of, say, hey, if we start with the intent of looking at the quantitative and saying, hey, how many are doing this? And then out of that, we start to see, then we want to say, okay, well, why? But then you flip that on its side and say, okay, if we start with a qualitative approach and say, well, why are people doing this? And you say, okay, people are feeling this way. So then we want to then ask, well, how many people are feeling this way, right?
Yeah.
So it just really depends on, I think, where you start and where you're going with it and what your initial intent is. And so again, one of the things that it talks about with the qualitative piece is the emerging aspect of it is always evolving, and you may find yourself starting here, but you know, 3 weeks later, you're totally in a different world that you did not think that you would find yourself in, right? And so that's one of the things that kind of worries me, is just the ambiguity. I can never say that word, just the vagueness of how it can just be all over the place, and you really have to, you know, pin it down and narrow it down to what your research question is and what is it that you're chasing after.
I think the chapter does a good job at describing what qualitative research is. So I'll just do a quick like synopsis of like what he said or she said. I'm not sure it's the author, male, she said. So qualitative research begins with the assumption. So as we've been talking about, we're assuming this is happening. So from there, we want to build a research around that assumption that we thought something happened. Like you said, we thought the kids were feeling that Jimmy John's was nasty or they didn't like it. So now we're going to go from there and to assume what something's happening. So we're going to build that assumption from it. So, and then from that assumption, we use it to interpretive frameworks that inform the study of research problems, addressing the meaning of individuals or groups. So we all talked about how when there's a group affected from it, that's kind of where we see from there, like, okay, the group's affected, why is it affected? We all talked about that. So I feel that it seems like we're getting qualitative research down. Now putting it on paper and interpreting it the correct way, that is my problem. That's what my problem has been. So gotta redo a few of the papers we have to do, but I'm getting there.
Well, another thing that I think what I learned from this chapter, and even what you just said, Toni, is the rigorousness of qualitative research. And this also go back to something, Trice, is that you start one place and you may realize you have to drift and adjust based on the massive amount of data collection that you essentially have to get on a few things. And I think that that's really important to making sure, you know, when reading again the Gephardt and Rines, the editorial on like what they're looking for in qualitative research is the thing about qualitative research is the actual research part of it, the actual turning observation
Right.
into data is extensive in a way that a yes/no statement or something you're testing isn't going to be as variable and as, you know, like I said, you're not going to change midstream. The way you may need to adapt, and you have the responsibility to adapt when you're doing qualitative research. And so that's kind of the other piece that I think people have a misconception that, you know, even we heard it in our in-person. Well, quantitative's like the, you know, that's the scientific method. That's the real research. When it's like, actually, no, qualitative, like good qualitative research is extensive and rigorous and requires a lot of data collection, requires a lot of ethical musings as you do every piece of this project. Not that quantitative doesn't have that, but it just, the work happens in different places. So I thought that was kind of something these chapters are kind of reinforcing to me.
And we want to make sure we cover all the bases. So what I also heard you say that triggered the thought, Alisha, is from the ethical standpoint of things, is when we, going back to what Toni said, when we make these assumptions and we start to get into these interpretations, and then as the stuff emerges and evolves, you know, our hypothesis maybe now is proven wrong. And now how do you now take your bias, right, and cage the bias to say, no, because we come in this with our bias and we know that we feel a way about this particular issue or topic. And then now we got to get into, that's the one piece of the ethics of making sure that you streamline or mitigate your bias as best as possible, or at least acknowledge it as you change whatever your philosophy may be or your interpretation, but just how that impacts the ethical side of things and the potential ethical issue. So this is all starting to come in line. So I can appreciate this, but I'll shut up now. Thank you.
Well, I think this has been a very good discussion and defense and understanding of qualitative research. Does anyone have any lingering points they'd like to make before we call it?
No, I appreciate the invite to join you too.
Yeah, this is a really good conversation. Like, I think I'm really prepared to write the paper, so thank you both.
Yeah, good luck with that too. So have a good weekend.
Have
a good afternoon.
Weekend.
All right, thanks.